talk to you today about this question that has bothered me most of my life. I should say intrigued me most of my life, because at this point I think I found an answer, and I'm hoping to share it with you. And the question is this: why do some people manage to make a difference in the world and others don't? For a long time, I thought it was a matter of pedigree, or titles, or a series of other things around who had power. Because if it's only that group, then it means that only a few of us are allowed to bring our ideas. And that means that all the talent, all the creativity, all the solutions that we actually do need aren't going to be available to us. I remember one time when I essentially faced this question in the most personal way. Someone turned to me and put their hand out to shake mine and asked me, "And who are you?" And which is a really surprisingly innocuous question. I bet you're going to ask each other that later tonight at the party. But at that particular moment, my mind completely froze. Because as I was standing in this circle of people, this muckety-muck VC answered, and then a really prominent CEO, and then a hotshot entrepreneur, and when it came around to my turn, as my brain was scrolling through sort of possible answers, I ended up coming up with, "I'm nobody. I'm nobody." Had I really just said that? Yes, I had. And what was going on in my mind is at that moment, I had just finished shutting down my professional firm. And I was in this quandary about who I was, what it meant for my future, and even my value in the world. And so while my friends jumped in and answered the question and shared some of my CV and bought me that minute, I knew that I had just faced the question again in a way, and I didn't like my answer. It was this tension of my life, because up to that moment, what I'd been doing for 11 years of consulting is helping companies do innovation. I had been the one standing there showing them that fresh, new, disruptive ideas come from anywhere inside their organization, that ideas can and do and should come from anywhere, everywhere. I had been the one green-lighting all those people who didn't have the right degrees after their names or the right titles that they came with, and yet they were the ones who were going to help us write those ideas from left field. So I had been embodying that, and yet in that very moment of answering the question, "I am nobody," what had I actually just said? I had accepted and affirmed, repeated, and even perpetuated the myth of who gets to have ideas. And so there I was, basically red-lighting myself in that moment and wondering, what is it to do? This paradox was one that I kind of sat with for a little while, and I actually was sort of trying to figure out how to sort of shove it deeper inside myself and kind of go, maybe one day I can ignore this moment that just happened, pretend it never did. And yet, what I was facing next was really, I was watching this next generation of innovation happen in the marketplace, and that's where I was really focusing my attention. And because it so directly ties to this story of I am nobody, and how do we actually get talent unlocked, I'm going to share why I wandered down this other path. So studying next generation innovation, and this was around 2011, 2012, and noticing that what was driving innovation was coming from a really different place. We were no longer looking at talent in the way that we used to. So talent, just historical point of view, talent used to be embodiment in the physical core. So if you had a cotton gin and we needed people, we needed talent, what we needed was a body that worked. If your hand chopped off, no big deal, we'll find another body. And then we went to an evolution of that, which was about efficiency of the body. So how fast could you build the car? That's what drove talent. And then we went to a phase where we looked at how would we actually capitalize more ideas. So now we're starting to see this disbursement go to a much broader place and have ideas come from places, but it was still really limited by who would get capital. And then this thing I was watching in the field of innovation was how much platforms and network economy stuff was letting ideas come from anywhere. That basically without very much capital, without a capital infrastructure, you could actually figure out how to bring ideas to market. And the thing that caught my eye was the mobile industry, because I had been in mobile for a super long time when companies used to choose what products went on deck. So they would pick 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 apps that would go on deck. This is dating me, I know, and dating some of us who remember these experiences. But it used to cost $1 or $2 million to do development, plus a sales force to get on deck. And then Apple changed the game by saying, if we change the development cost, we can go from $2 million to $10,000. It's $500 today, by the way. And that meant that people anywhere in the world could start to develop and add their little bit to the world, whatever that looked like. For consumers, it meant we had more choice. For companies, it meant changing the ecosystem and actually going from owning and controlling everything to co-creating content together. But what it changed with the creator, the idea, the inventor, was the opportunity that each of us could kind of come up with little bubbles over our head and figure out how to get it to market. And this seemed to me so crucial. And so I coined a term to actually capture this economic trend. It was onlyness. And it's this braided notion that says each of us stands in a spot in the world only you stand in, a function of your history and experience, visions and hopes. And from that place is where all new ideas and creativity and innovations come from. Now that you can actually be connected with other people through distributed networks, you have an ability to scale that idea in a way we've never done before. The thing was that even as I did this economic term and published it in a Harvard book and blah, 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 I still hadn't resolved the question I had, or that maybe some of you have, who are nobodies, who don't have title, who don't have the sort of credentials behind you. Can you, too, be one of those people that contribute your ideas to the world? So if you're a nobody, how do you get your ideas to make a difference? And that's what I spent the last 5 years doing. And the reason I'm so nervous today, actually, you're the first audience that gets to hear me share the last 5 years of research on a book I've been deeply sunk into, and now coming up for air and trying to figure out how to express all these ideas back to you. But that's what I want to share now. Remember back at that party when I said, I don't belong here, having just been unemployed, and before I was a CEO and considered pretty talented in the field of innovation and pretty successful in that way, at that moment, when I didn't have that to hang my hat on, and I was surrounded by other movers and shakers, what I said was, I don't belong here. Right? And this question of belonging, turns out to be the key to everything. Belonging is the most fundamental human psychological need. Before we can claim our ideas, before we get to have the right to occupy space, we have to first belong. And this turns out to be the key insight for every story I research. I did over 300 pieces of research. And the piece I figured out was to be able to contribute that which only you can, you have to first belong. Without it, we can be in a room surrounded by other people and still feel deeply lonely, right? We've all been in that place. Maybe our families, because sometimes our parents and teachers have taught us to be normal and told us to give up the part that is distinct to ourselves. And our bosses and leaders often build on that foundation. And so we learn how not to stand in our own truth. But onlyness, in all the stories I researched, what I found out, in order for those people to contribute, and it wasn't because they weren't bold, it's because they finally figured out how to belong and find their people. And so that's why I think some of the advice that we sometimes get from stages and all the sort of self-help genre is it says, be you, be bolder. And I'm like, I don't think so. Based on all this research, I think we're actually giving the wrong advice. I think we have to figure out how to belong to our people. Now, I'm going to share 3 stories. I'm just pulling from the book at this point. I wish they were Irish stories, so I hope that maybe next year I get to come back and do some research and share an Irish story around that. But to start, I want to share a story of Kim Bryant. Kim had gotten a job at DuPont. This was her second job out of engineering school at Vanderbilt. And she got told, when she got introduced to her team, her boss called her, these are his direct words, with Kim, we got a twofer. Because Kim, as a black woman in tech, was being characterized that way. And she felt so uncomfortable in that moment. Because what her boss was showing was her otherness, not her uniqueness. not what she was going to uniquely bring to that job, not how she was going to be connected to her peer group of engineers, but what set her apart. Otherness is what allows you to not belong. It makes you different than. So therefore, it unempowers you. And Kim was really disturbed then when she saw her own daughter Kai was experiencing otherizing when she went to a Stanford code camp. And she saw that the largely white, largely male environment was doing this to her daughter, so she thought, maybe I can find a way to fix this. And she gathered a bunch of Kai's friends around a kitchen table, borrowed some computers, and started coding and teaching these girls to code. And at some point, this had started taking over weekends and then ultimately weeks, and it was starting to kind of occupy more and more of her time, so she was thinking about, I should call this something. And she was really struggling with the name of it. And she shared this dilemma with an entrepreneur friend who turned to her and said, if what you're doing is teaching black girls to code, call it that. But the reason that Kim and a lot of us might shy away from claiming a word that other people have deemed a certain way might be because we don't want to take on or deal with other people's understanding of a particular phrase, particular way that a group is looked at. But her standing in that spot, only she stood in, meant that she had to stand and claim black and say for herself, what is it that it means for me? And she knew that black is beautiful. And just because American society had not, doesn't mean that it wasn't true for her. And so her strength was taken away in otherness and brought back in onlyness, which is what we can all do when we can stand in that spot in the world only we stand in. And yet what she did is actually incredibly hard to do, as the social science research shows. Deloitte did some research in the last couple of years, and it says that 61% of us conform, find ways to fit in, find ways to hide ourselves. In fact, the most staggering piece of the statistics was, it went like 89% of this group and 79% of this group, but it got to white males, and it said that nearly half of white males, 45% to be specific, conform and find a way to fit in. And some of the examples were young men who wear glasses, who try to look more experienced, or people who didn't want to admit how much they wanted to be at home with their families. So different ways in which they were basically willing to give up themselves in order to fit into some archetype or stereotype about what was expected of them. When we're doing that, we're not actually living into our truth. We're not living into the things we believe and value. And so when 61% of us are doing it, that's a huge cost to our future selves. Because we're not speaking up at meetings, we're not starting our own companies based on these ideas, we're not advocating for a point of view because we think our company should go this direction, not that. And so by not being able to speak our own truth, we're denying the company that we work with or the future idea that we could build into a company the opportunity for error. So when Kim did it, one of her strengths was that she was, sorry, I just clicked ahead. One of the strengths and the reason she was able to do it is when she claimed Black Girls Code, she was actually surrounding herself by people in her community already. And they were the ones who were looking at her saying, we want you to serve us. And in doing so, she actually has really tectonically affected the tech industry. So here she was working inside the tech industry, unable to change it. And she steps into her own truth. And she's already trained 10,000 girls, which is pretty phenomenal. And one of the things she knows is that this is the hottest growth market happening, that we need more people to code. And so she thought, what if we could actually figure out a way to fill that pipeline with people that look more like her? Then no one could stand there and call her a twofer, the next generation, right? Alex was 23 and living in Philadelphia. And I share his story next because Alex shows us the power of how to find your friends. So Alex was 23, working as a web developer in Philadelphia, and couldn't find anybody that looked like him. And so he kept thinking, well, all my geeky developer-type creative people must be out west, California. And so he was actually looking for jobs out there, and so excited that he was finally going to get to be with people like him. And at one point, the job fell through, and he kind of thought, gosh, but I really want that. I want sort of like the ability to work with a company like Google, but I don't really want to work and live in a place that is that expensive. I really love Philadelphia. And so he started thinking, well, maybe I should give this city one more shot. And one of the first things he did was he changed from wearing suits to showing up in ironic t-shirts and flannels, which the pictures kind of suggest, right? In fact, he used to hide his tattoo. One says JFDI on it, just fucking do it. And the other one I learned is a fermata. A fermata is a musical, any of you know what a fermata is? You do, right? Already know? No, okay, you don't know. So it's the pause in a musical sheet, and it allows all the musicians to gather back up to the same space so they can play together. I think that's really interesting because what Alex was doing when he was all lonely was actually trying to figure out how to play with other people. And so he went to coffee shops now in these ironic t-shirts, and he went to networking events, and he basically was signaling really hard, like, this is who I am. And then slowly but surely found people and said, you want to go out to beer, you want to get to know each other, you want to hang out in a coffee shop, you want to code together, and so on and so on. Until they finally had a crew of 20 people actually taking over coffee shops in Philadelphia, which I can only imagine what that looked like, this herd of people showing up. And they joined together and finally looked at each other and thought, where are people? And they formed something called Indie Hall in Philadelphia. Indie Hall is one of the first co-working spaces, and now one of 5 in Philadelphia. And at one point, I reached out to the deputy mayor of Philadelphia and asked, well, what did Indie Hall mean for the city? And he said, oh, it was a way for us to finally serve a community that was once invisible. We didn't even know they existed. But we wanted them to exist because we wanted to be a tech center. We wanted to serve, and be this more vital place. And yet, it wasn't until Indie Hall got created that we were able to actually make visible that which was invisible to us, and then figure out how to serve a group of people, and then make that work even better for them. So that process of sort of signaling who you are, that moment of going from suit to t-shirt turns out to be really key. And then that active effort to go, okay, are you my people? Are you my people? You are, by the way, you are my people, front row. I look at all those beautiful faces, thank you. One of the things that happened when I first coined the term loneliness, people would walk up and say it reminded them of loneliness. Did it do that for you? Yes? No? Didn't come up? So one of the things that I think we really struggle with as a society is how to be different, and yet, and that can also mean ourselves, right? And still find a way to belong. And so quite often, being different has been quite difficult. In fact, the research says that if we're less than 15% of a group, we will give up our ideas like mad because we are essentially a token in that group. And Rosabeth Moss Kanter wrote about that in the 1970s. And I'm struck by that because it means if you're a woman in a corporate board setting, if you're a super entrepreneurial type in a work of, in the world of corporate drones and you feel like you're such an odd duck, maybe you're super young in a group full of, mostly not so young people, and I'm not putting any ages to that because it can all be relative. We can feel like the odd duck and then go, gosh, I really don't know if they want my opinion here. And so loneliness can be a derivative of being different. And the question is, though, how do you actually start to address that loneliness? It's only when you can find the people who care about the same things as you. And so we often think about loneliness as this sort of mathematical equation, and it's actually more a relational equation. How do I find the people who care about the same things as me so we can be connected with one another? And that's when we get our buddies, and that's when we feel safe enough to explore a new idea and can take the risk to go build the future. The third story I want to share is a story of Zachary Walls. And the reason I chose him in sharing it with you is a story about how all of this scales. Because most of the time, onlys, for many years, centuries, have actually been able to sometimes be artists or be sort of like quirky little things, but this is the moment where all this stuff can really create an impact. And Zach, in fact, was, I think he was like first 5 or 6, he tells me the story, 5 or 6 when he figured out that he was really different. So at first he thought, I'm just like every other kid. I like dirt, I like cars, I like the Boy Scouts. He spent all the time with his family doing Boy Scout things in the weekend. And sometime around 6 or 7, he figured out that the answer he was giving when somebody said, well, who are your parents? He would say the truth, and he learned really quickly not to tell that truth. So he learned how to kind of obfuscate it. And it turns out that Zach was one of the first IVF kids that were born in the United States. So back then it was called test tube babies, and it means that he was born of 2 moms. And yet, absolutely loved the Boy Scouts. And so it turns out to be a gay troop leader is not allowed. And it's also not allowed that a gay kid can earn the highest award in the Boy Scouts. So for a long time, Zach basically skirted the process by having his troop leader kind of, allow for certain things and so on and so on. 6, 7 years goes by, and he realizes he's no longer willing to live in the silence, because what the Boy Scouts had taught him was to honor his own truth. So at some point, he started figuring out he could be an agent of change. And he found this petition site called change.org. And he thought, what if it's only a couple hundred people who sign up, but let me see if I can actually help create change. And he thought one lever might be to figure out how to defund the Boy Scouts of America because of their discriminatory policies. So he found out which companies were funding them, which ones had policies, like Accenture today spoke about their policies. So imagine getting a company identified. In his case, he had identified Intel and UPS as 2 companies that combined together contributed $900,000 to the BSA. So he said, I will figure out a way to get this money taken away so BSA will change. And I wish I could announce to you that it did. It didn't. It actually took Zach doing his petition work and then other Boy Scouts coming along and doing additional petition work, and him actually saying, even if my work didn't yield, I'm going to stick around long enough to figure out how to get other people through this process. And so joined a Facebook group and figured out how to help other Boy Scouts. And ultimately they did. They got the Boy Scouts to not only change the policies towards the kids, but towards the Scout leaders, and now has an open policy. Ideas now scale because of the capacity to find people like me. And so let's just kind of think about what like me means for just a second. Most of us, when we answer the who are you question, we're leading with the things like title, job, degree, maybe gender. Sometimes, if you're in a room that feels a certain way, you might say, well, I'm a woman entrepreneur, right? You might lead with that. Andrew Solomon offers us some language around this. He says identity is both vertical and horizontal. Vertical is where we're born from. So our age, our socioeconomic condition, our gender, our color is often informed by who we were born to. But the second identity is horizontal. All the things we care about are what connect us to people. And I love that distinction about vertical and horizontal. And I felt like it played into onlyness in a particular way, because I said it slightly differently than him. I said onlyness was a function of our history and experiences and our visions and hopes. Because what I was saying is we are not just everything we've been born into, we are also everything we care about. The story might start a certain way, but the story advances through what we are passionate about. And that, to me, seems like where the magic lies. And what Kim and Zach and Alex show us in their stories. Kim stood in that spot. She could have denied the strength of black, but she didn't. And in doing so, she's not only helped 10,000 girls learn how to code, but she is reshaping her entire industry off that move. Alex could have sat there and thought, yeah, I don't really belong here in this city. And instead, he found the friends by which he could actually have professional affiliation, and it changed the entire city's ability to serve that community. Zach could have ignored his love of his mom's, and he didn't. And he found a way for love to be much more inclusive in his community, and ultimately to change the shape of equality, at least in the United States. At the time that Zach was fighting, in fact, he said to himself, none of this will matter. It may not actually make an impact, but I'm going to do my bit. And the stories of onlyness, one of the things I learned as I was going through this is how much people basically acted. We were actually talking about this morning, Anna. People acted in spite of evidence of what would happen because they said, this is what I believe in. And this is also then how we can belong. So only through belonging can we ultimately express all of our ideas. And ideas are going to be the key, right? Ideas are the things we pull on that pull us into the future. They disrupt the status quo, and they incubate everything we need, every solution that humanity needs. And so how do we belong? If we belong by the artifices of job title and external things, then we will find ourselves lost. But if we belong in ways that are about being connected, then we will find ourselves deeply able to do big things. Not because We have been born into a certain place, but because we know what matters to us. And by expressing and standing in that truth, we will find the other people who care about the same thing as us. Now, I shared with you that I have a book coming out in the fall, and I think this entire journey has been so interesting for me because I have to sit there and go, okay, now who am I? Who am I now? So clearly I'm a recovering business executive turned author, learning how to express the early ideas of loneliness. But one of the things that I really learned is how much loneliness has mattered to me. For all these years, I've always wanted to find a way to have each voice count, to be able to shine a light and be able to say each of us matter. Not because we have any background or affiliation, but because we each have value to add. And loneliness says, even if the world has taught you that you are a nobody, that's not true. You are actually powerful beyond measure. And so I hope that you'll join with me as friends and as colleagues, as leaders and bosses, to think about how do you bring out that only of yours, to stand in that spot in the world only you stand in, a function of your history and experience, visions and hopes, and from that place, find those people with whom you want to do great big things, even when it looks like it can't be possible, and still chase it because that's what matters to you. Thank you.